Russia is a major exporter of oil, and Ukraine is the breadbasket of the world. Food and energy prices were already rising before the invasion of Ukraine. So what might be the impact for low-income countries of a conflict that, though it is geographically far away, is sure to have impacts much closer to home? Hello, Rabah, welcome.
Hello, Tim.
Rabah, this is a serious conflict, but these two nations are a long way from Africa. So why might the war in Ukraine have an impact for African countries?
Yeah, put simply, the invasion of Ukraine has two distinct effects on food market. First, the invasion raised the risk of food supply disruption for countries that are directly importing from either Ukraine or Russia. But second, the invasion also has sent international food prices higher with far-reaching implications. The devastation from the war and the sanctions have derailed supply of food to countries importing from Ukraine and Russia and exposed these importers to food shortages. It's not easy to get alternative food supply in the midst of such crisis. Countries around the Mediterranean Sea like Egypt, Lebanon, and Tunisia, but many others, African and non-African countries like Nigeria, Ethiopia, Sudan, Bangladesh, Iran get a large share of their food supply directly from either Russia or Ukraine. Besides the risk of food supply, the invasion has also sent international food prices skyrocketing for all sorts of food products. Together, Ukraine and Russia account for 30% of world wheat export and 70% of sunflower oil export. The crisis is thus having a global impact on net importers, well beyond the countries importing directly from Ukraine or Russia. If the war persists, the upheaval on food market will be long-lasting. Indeed, Russia is also an important exporter of fertilizer. The planting season for wheat is fast approaching, and rising cost of fertilizer will further support prices. Add to that food crisis, the energy crisis, with both natural gas and oil prices skyrocketing, which is feeding into domestic and international transport costs, including of food.
What sort of price rises are we seeing, Rabah?
In the past few weeks, the prices of both energy and food have reached spectacular level, and they add to the upward trend we've seen over the past 2 years or so. Brent oil prices are hovering around 112 USD per barrel, levels it has not reached since the great collapse in oil prices in 2014. Natural gas prices are about 8 times what they were last year. Wheat prices have increased about 40% since the invasion, sunflower oil by about 30%. So food prices have really reached record levels since 2011, a year sadly remembered for the social unrest in North Africa and the Middle East and beyond. So net importer of food and energy like Egypt, Tunisia, Lebanon are faced with a dual energy and food price shock, which is widening their external deficit and raising their already high level of debt. The spread on sovereign borrowing for Egypt, Tunisia, and even Pakistan have doubled over these few weeks, and this is pointing to socio-economic risk. So borrowing costs are reaching record levels for developing and emerging markets, with balance of payment and debt crisis looming.
Are there not, though, in Africa and the Middle East, some countries that are exporters of commodity products? Might this actually be good news for them?
So oil exporters, such as Nigeria, are benefiting from the increase in oil prices, no doubt, but because they're often heavily dependent on imports of food, including wheat or edible oil, the benefit from higher oil price is reduced. That said, also Nigeria is importing a refined product from oil, which has been skyrocketing. By the same token, food exporter of products such as wheat, corn, sugar, edible oil, like South Africa, stands to benefit on the export side, but again, will lose on the import side because these countries are typically importers of energy.
Now, looking at the micro level, what are the consequences of for the poorest people in this region of these price rises?
So the African continent is particularly vulnerable to this food crisis because it's home to 70% of the world's poor. For most households in low-income countries, energy and food expenditure account for over half of their total expenditure. The increase in prices is having devastating consequences on food security and poverty. refugees all over Africa, the Middle East, and people in post-conflict or conflict-affected countries like Sudan, Yemen are particularly vulnerable. Of course, population in rural area and producers who grow food are typically less vulnerable than people in urban area, but a series of climate change related drought, including in Madagascar and the Horn of Africa, have sparked famines. The UN Food and Agriculture Organization has warned about 13 million individuals facing hunger just in the Horn of Africa.
What can the governments do about this to make the impact of this crisis less severe for these people?
So government have used a myriad of policy intervention. There's really roughly two groups, two categories of countries. Those who use so-called universal consumer subsidies, typically price control, and those who let the price pass through from international to domestic prices, but then target the poor. And these two systems have radically different incentive for both producer and consumer. On top of this, countries have also put export ban to ensure food security, but also with perverse incentive on spiraling international prices and disincentivizing local producer. Many countries have also built strategic reserve of food, but many have already exhausted them.
I mean, post-financial crisis, post the COVID crisis as well, is there enough wiggle room for countries to be able to afford these kind of interventions, subsidies, cash transfers?
Yeah, even if targeted, this cash transfer can prove quite costly if the private sector are oligopolies and face inelastic demand for food and therefore pass more of the international price increase to domestic prices. Building a more inclusive and efficient social protection system would be a much better way to limit people falling into poverty, but that is very costly. And many countries, developing countries, that is, lack fiscal space and are struggling have been struggling against COVID and its aftermath. So many African countries have limited buffers, they have high level of debt. This needs urgent restructuring if we want to avoid the worst. And of course, in the medium run, many countries in the continent have the potential to develop much better functioning food system and transform their agricultural sector to limit food dependency and address food insecurity. But for this, they need to address long-standing issues in the land sector, but also in access to capital, but also address important issues of competition, both also in the transport and distribution sector.
Previous economic crises like this have led to increased conflict in Africa, in the Middle East. We're thinking especially of the Arab Spring. Is it possible that the conflict in Ukraine will inevitably lead to more conflict in developing countries?
Yeah, the link between food prices and social unrest has been well documented, including my research with Marcus Brüchner, but also more recently by Kurt Piesman. And the episode of the 2007, 2008, and also 2011 stark reminder of the dramatic consequences of food price spikes. And the recent wave of coup in West Africa, the protests we've seen all over the continent, have to do with rising inflation, which has reached double digit for many countries in the African continent. But they also have deeper roots in the grievances regarding insecurity and poor development outcome. Population in the continent, especially the youth, which account for the majority of the population, are increasingly aware of how divergent the path of Africa versus the rest of the world is, and the difference in standards of living. Therefore, they go on social media, and this sparks unrest. So the invasion of Ukraine clearly could spark further unrest, and have important spillover across border within Africa, but also beyond.
Clearly, at the moment, everyone's focus, certainly in Europe and North America, is specifically on Ukraine. But is there a message from this for high-income countries that they need to be taking some action to prevent what is at the moment a regional conflict becoming a more global one?
So the international community, through the World Bank, the IMF, should provide financial support to these countries, making sure it supports effectively the most vulnerable segment of the population. The international community also need to support much bolder action and prompt restructuring of debt in developing countries, invoking the force majeure that Patrick Bonton and Hugo Fanizza, among others, have advocated. If not, most of the financial support and resources of developing countries is going to the pockets of foreign private creditors at the time we need these resources to go directly to people who need it the most. But of course, and importantly, we all hope that the international community comes together very strongly to stop that invasion and bring peace back to Ukraine.
Yes. Well, let's hope for that, and let's hope for strong, decisive policy actions as you recommend. Rabah, thank you very much.
Thanks, Tim.
Rabah's written an article about this. It's called Ukraine Invasion, Africa is Vulnerable to Soaring Energy and Food Prices. You can read it in English at the Economic Research Forum or in French in Le Monde. There is also a CEPR ebook from last year for which Rabah was one of the editors. It's called Shaping Africa's Post-COVID Recovery. If you want to download it, the link's on screen now, and it covers many of the issues that we've been talking about today. Well, thanks for watching, and we'll see you soon.